Have you ever spent 17 years building something, only to have it ripped away in less than 17 seconds? That is my story. My name is Rhea Benton. I am 41 years old, born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota. For most of my adult life, I worked as a principal systems architect at a mid-sized tech firm called Nexora, based out of Chicago. You would not find my name on press releases or glossy brochures, but behind every successful product launch, every multi-million-dollar contract, and every smooth system migration, I was there, quiet, steady, invisible. I never chased the spotlight. I chased stability, precision, and long-term results. And that is exactly why they got rid of me. It was a Monday morning in early spring, chilly, gray, and already full of emails by the time I poured my second coffee. What made it different was that it happened to be my birthday. I had just turned 41. I remember laughing softly to myself when I sat down at my desk, thinking, another year older, but at least I still love my job. That feeling lasted all of 10 seconds. I opened my laptop, typed in my credentials like I had done every morning for nearly 2 decades, and got slapped in the face with a simple message. Access denied. I blinked, thought maybe I typed it wrong, tried again, same thing. Tried once more, still locked out. It was not a glitch. It was not a mistake. I was out, and I did not even know it yet. I checked my personal email. There it was, a message sent at 3:14 in the morning, timestamped like a bad breakup text. The subject line read, Strategic Realignment Notification. No greeting, no name, just an impersonal note from something called the Strategic Alignment Unit. I'd never heard of that department before. As far as I knew, it did not exist until that very moment. The message said my role had been retired as part of operational optimization efforts. No thank you for my years of service, no exit interview, not even a phone call, just a digital shove into the void. Still confused, I called the IT help desk. A robotic voice answered, routed me through 3 useless prompts. Then a young man picked up, asked for my employee ID, and immediately transferred me. Without saying a word. The line went dead. When I called back, I was sent straight to voicemail. I sat there in silence, gripping the phone like it might suddenly start explaining things. That was the moment it hit me. I had been fired. Not laid off, not moved to another role. Fired on my birthday by a faceless unit that was probably invented just to clean out people like me. I wish I could say I was surprised, but if I am being honest, I had seen the warning signs. It started months earlier, right after Nexora brought in a flashy new chief technology officer named Miles Corbin. He was 36, energetic, smooth-talking, and very obviously gunning for a big shakeup. The board loved him. He promised innovation, disruption, and eliminating legacy baggage, which, as I would soon learn, included me. I was legacy. Not because I was obsolete, but because I remembered how things actually worked. Because I built most of the systems from scratch. Because I asked questions and did not blindly follow his half-baked modernization plans. And in a company now obsessed with appearances over performance, that made me a threat. So yes, there was anger. But more than that, there was betrayal. I had sacrificed so much for that company. Late nights, missed holidays. I mentored younger engineers. I patched servers on weekends. I was the person they called when everything broke. And I never asked for recognition, just respect. Instead, I got a 3 a.m. email and a locked account. What made it worse? I could still see the Slack messages on my phone, buzzing with celebration from the new team. They had just finalized a major contract with the city of Chicago, a project I had personally laid the foundation for. And they were acting like I never existed. What they did not know, what none of them bothered to ask, was that the deal they were celebrating, it was not valid, not legally, not without me. Because buried deep in that shiny new system they were showing off to investors was a quiet little biometric lock, one that only I could open, one that I built myself 2 years ago for security reasons. And while they were busy popping champagne and pretending they built everything from scratch, I was sitting at home, watching them dig their own grave. I did not plan revenge that morning. Not yet. But I knew something they did not. I still had the keys. And I was not about to let them walk away with my work. Not after what they did. not without paying the price. If you had asked me 6 months ago whether I thought one person could unravel 17 years of stability, I would have said, no. No single person can bring down an entire engineering legacy overnight. But I would have been wrong. 2 weeks before I got locked out, Nexora welcomed a new chief technology officer with a six-figure smile and a suitcase full of buzzwords. His name was Miles Corbin, 36 years old, the kind of guy who quotes startup founders in every conversation and treats whiteboards like therapy sessions. He came in hot, preaching cloud agility, horizontal disruption, and my personal favorite, removing operational bloat. I had been in tech long enough to translate what that meant. He was here to get rid of people like me. Miles did not have time for the quiet folks who had been holding the system together. To him, I was not a person. I was legacy code in human form. He walked past me in the halls like I was a vending machine. During our first meeting together, me, him, and a room full of engineers, I introduced myself and barely got a nod. Later, when someone asked about the structure of our data management system, he waved his hand and said, "That old school ballast? We will phase it out." I remember looking around the room. No one said anything. They just nodded along, pretending not to notice I was the one who built the very system he was mocking. I felt invisible in a room I used to lead. The worst part was not that he was young or confident. It was that he was careless. He did not bother to understand what Nexora was built on. He came in with a wrecking ball and no blueprint. Within his first week, he reassigned half our legacy engineers to non-essential innovation roles, which was just corporate speak for keeping them around until it was less awkward to fire them. He cut our maintenance testing windows in half. He had junior developers pushing to production with no oversight. I watched him bulldoze through protocols that had taken us years to refine. When I raised concerns, he brushed me off. "We are not running a museum here, Raya," he said, smirking like that was the cleverest thing he had ever said. What Miles failed to grasp was that everything he was so eager to dismantle had been holding up Nexora's most profitable contracts, especially the $2.1 billion integration deal with the city of Chicago. It was the largest and most sensitive project we had ever taken on. That system alone handled interdepartmental communications, automated permit approvals, and linked municipal data across 17 agencies. It took 4 years to build and another 2 to harden. I had spent holidays and weekends on that architecture. And now, Miles was letting developers with less than a year of experience rewrite critical components without even consulting me. I tried to warn him. During a performance review meeting, I pulled him aside and mentioned that the new sync engine they were testing could cause data loop issues under real-time conditions. He smiled, thanked me, and then told the team the next day that I was resistant to change. That phrase stung more than I thought it would. I was not afraid of change. I just knew what happened when you changed things without knowing what they did in the first place. But at Nexora, it seemed like being the loudest voice in the room mattered more than being the most experienced. I had stopped getting calendar invites for core architecture meetings. My Slack channels went quiet. People started calling me consultant, even though I was still full-time. Miles had a talent for making people feel irrelevant without ever saying it directly. And in that silence, the systems began to bend under his shiny new vision. What he did not understand, or maybe did not care to, is that his so-called bloat was the reason Nexora had never once missed a contract deadline or had a major data loss. He thought he could tear down a house without checking where the wires ran, but those wires went deep, and one of them ran straight through a security protocol I built into the Chicago contract system. A biometric lock that only I could activate. I do not think Miles even knew it existed. He was too busy chasing headlines, too busy planning his next TED Talk. But while he was trying to erase the past, I was quietly watching him walk into a trap of his own making. And the best part? I did not even have to lift a finger. He was doing it all on his own. All I had to do was wait. It did not happen with a bang. It started slowly, like water creeping under a locked door. No official notice. No one sat me down to explain anything. But one morning, I opened the internal company dashboard, and my title had changed. I was no longer listed as Principal Systems Architect. I was now labeled Contract Systems Liaison, a title so vague it could have meant anything, or nothing at all. I clicked around, hoping it was a system error. It was not. I was no longer assigned to any of the teams I had led for years. I had no meeting invites. My access to core repositories was read only. I refreshed the screen, half expecting it to go back to normal. But it stayed the same. I had been erased quietly, deliberately. When I confronted human resources about it, they gave me a rehearsed smile and a canned answer. "We are just restructuring, Raya. Your skills are still valuable. This is just part of the new organizational model." I asked them what exactly my new responsibilities were. They could not give me a straight answer. I asked why no one had informed me of the title change. They said it must have been an oversight. The longer I sat there, the clearer it became. They were not planning to keep me involved in anything that mattered. They just wanted me out of the way. Not with a pink slip, not with dignity. Just phased out quietly until I disappeared on my own. At the same time, I noticed someone else's name popping up where mine used to be. Sienna Lowe. She was 27, sharp, eager, and fresh out of a coding boot camp. I had nothing against her. In fact, I liked her. She had potential. But she was not ready to take on the kind of architecture I had spent years building. Still, Miles took a liking to her. He started inviting her to senior-level meetings. She became the face of the new systems initiative. He praised her modern thinking and fresh perspective. Meanwhile, she was rewriting code she barely understood. Code I had spent hundreds of nights refining, debugging, and documenting. Watching her touch those systems felt like watching someone try to renovate a house by smashing through the walls. I kept trying to be professional. I offered to review her changes, to help her understand the logic behind the data syncing framework. She nodded politely, but I could tell she had been told not to involve me. My documentation began to disappear from the shared drive. Dependencies I had built into our legacy pipelines were rewritten, commented out, or deleted altogether. They were dismantling everything I had constructed, and they did not even know what they were breaking. They thought it was old, outdated, unnecessary. But those old-school systems were not some dusty pile of forgotten code. They were the foundation of the $2.1 billion contract with the city of Chicago. Every transaction, every verification, every compliance check ran through the structure I had built. They just could not see it. Then, the whispers started. One of my former teammates messaged me and asked if it was true that I was retiring. I was confused. "Why would I retire?" I asked. I never said anything about that. A few days later, another colleague said they had heard I was winding down and taking a step back to focus on life outside of work. That was not just a rumor. That was a narrative someone was crafting behind my back. I could guess who. It sounded like something Miles would float into conversation just loud enough to take hold. He wanted to make it seem like I was leaving on my own terms. That way, no one would ask questions when my name stopped appearing in project threads. I remember walking past a glass conference room and seeing Sienna presenting slides I had written years ago. Rebranded, of course. Miles was nodding along, smiling like a proud mentor. No one looked up. No one noticed me outside the door. It was surreal, like watching your own replacement being installed while you were still standing there. I was not ready to leave. I was not done, but they had already started pretending I was gone. And in a place like Nexora, perception was everything. If enough people believed I was no longer essential, then I would not be. What they failed to understand, or maybe just refused to accept, was that my systems were not just legacy code. They were the operational spine of Nexora's largest projects, especially the one they were bragging about to investors, the Chicago deal. They were betting the future of the company on a contract built on architecture they did not understand, held together by logic they could not replicate, and locked behind security measures they had not even noticed. They thought I was fading away quietly. What they did not know was that they were walking blind into a storm, and I was the only one who could see it coming. It started with a feeling, that gut-deep sense that something was off. I was reviewing the public-facing logs for the Chicago contract system one night, mostly out of habit. Even though I had been shut out of internal systems, my sandbox environment at home still had access to the last stable mirror of the architecture. I was curious, maybe a little spiteful, but mostly protective. Protective of something I had built with care over years. And that is when I saw it, a subtle shift in the version control history. A change pushed by Sienna, approved by Miles. One line of logic. Removed. Just one. But that single deletion triggered a slow crawl of alarm bells in my mind. That line was not flashy. It was not bold or complicated. It was a simple conditional check embedded deep inside the final submission protocol for the Chicago integration system. It validated bid package metadata, specifically whether the final digital form had passed legal clearance. Without it, the contract might still appear to be complete, even if critical legal validation had failed. That check was what made sure Nexora's bid was considered binding under the city's procurement standards. Without it, the contract was just a draft. A beautiful, shiny, well-organized draft with no legal power behind it. At first, I thought maybe they moved the validation elsewhere. Maybe it was rewritten into another part of the pipeline. But the more I followed the trail, the more certain I became. It was gone, stripped out, and no replacement existed. I went back and looked at the merge comment in the code repository. Cleaned up unused legacy logic for streamlining validation phase. I almost laughed when I read it. That was not unused logic. That was the logic. It was the backbone of the final legal compliance check. Without that, nothing was enforceable. Not a single clause, not a single dollar. What made my stomach twist was knowing how close we were to the finish line. I checked the city's integration timeline. Public records showed they had already entered the final processing phase. That meant they were preparing the financial ledger for the contract's first-year rollout. Nexora was expecting a minimum of $240 million in first-year payouts alone. If the city processed a broken submission and later found out it was not properly validated, the whole contract could be nullified. Delays, lawsuits, investigations. The damage would ripple out for months, maybe years. And the public fallout? It would be brutal. I sat in my kitchen staring at the code, letting it all sink in. This was not just a technical mistake. It was a structural flaw. One that could collapse the entire project. And the worst part was, no one at Nexora even realized it. They were too busy celebrating the launch to notice they were walking on a cracked foundation. I checked the internal chatter through a backdoor webhook I had set up during development. They were high-fiving over Slack, talking bonuses, talking headlines, talking awards. Not one mention of a final compliance audit, not one whisper of concern. And Sienna? I did not blame her. She did not know what that line of code meant. She had been told it was outdated. Miles had likely convinced her it was cleanup work, efficiency, modernization. She trusted him, and he trusted no one but himself. He was so convinced of his own brilliance, he had turned off every voice of experience around him. And now, that arrogance had left a billion-dollar project hanging by a thread I had woven into the system specifically to prevent this kind of disaster. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. Part of me wanted to message someone, to warn them, to fix it before it spiraled. But then I remembered the meeting rooms I'd been shut out of, the job title they changed without a word, the rumors about my retirement, the looks, the silence. I had been erased. But the thing about deleting someone without knowing what they built is that you never know what they took with them. And now, I had something Nexora desperately needed, something they did not even know they had lost. And I was not sure I wanted to give it back. Sometimes, doing the right thing feels like swallowing glass. That was the feeling I had the moment I decided to fix the mistake. Not for Nexora, not for Miles, not even for the team that had quietly erased me from their meetings and their memory. I did it for the city of Chicago, the people behind the contract, the government workers who had trusted me for years, the legal staff who had reviewed every line I wrote, and the technical leads who had built their operations around my architecture. I could not stand by and let them pay the price for a leadership team too arrogant to double-check their own changes. Even though Nexora had revoked most of my access, they had overlooked one thing. I still had my sandbox environment at home. It was a development instance I had cloned years ago for testing. It was not hooked into production, but it mirrored the structure almost exactly. I pulled it up on my personal laptop late that night and dug into the code. My hands moved automatically. I knew that system better than my own kitchen. I found the missing validation logic, rewrote the condition, and patched it back into place. Then I set up mock data, ran the compliance tests, and watched the green checkmarks light up one by one. It was working. The city's automated test suite, which ran nightly on partner systems, would now pull the corrected version instead of the broken one. I even injected the fix with the same naming convention Sienna had used, so it would blend in without raising questions. The test results would look clean. The contract would pass review. No one would know it had ever been broken. I had saved the deal, but not for Nexora, for the city, because those systems would serve millions of people. And if they failed, it would not be Miles who had to answer for it. It would be the public offices, the field agents, the data clerks, and every single person relying on those tools to do their job. After the patch passed, I sat there staring at the screen. It felt like a strange kind of grief. I had just rescued a project that belonged to a company that had tossed me aside without a second thought. They had taken everything from me, my title, my access, my voice, and yet I had given them something priceless in return: stability, legitimacy. I could have let it fail. I had every reason to. And maybe a part of me wanted to watch it crash, just so they would finally realize how important I had been. But I could not let it go down like that. My name may have been removed from the project files, but my fingerprints were still all over that system. If it failed, it would have felt like I failed. And I was not willing to wear that weight. What made it harder was knowing that they would never know what I had done. They would never thank me, never credit me. They would celebrate the contract as a clean win, completely unaware that they had come within inches of disaster. Miles would stand in front of the boardroom and take credit for closing a flawless deal. Sienna would be praised for her efficiency improvements. There would be no headlines about the near miss, no emails acknowledging what had been saved. But that was the cost of doing what was right in silence. Sometimes your reward is just knowing you stopped something from breaking, even when no one sees you do it. And deep down, I knew something else. By fixing that code, I had also planted a seed, a quiet, invisible truth buried inside the system, that no matter how hard they tried to erase me, I was still part of their foundation. My work still held up their biggest success. And while they were too busy rewriting history to notice, I had done what they could not. I had protected the legacy they claimed they no longer needed. I had saved them from their own ignorance. And as bitter as that tasted, it was also a kind of power, because now I was the only one who truly knew how fragile their empire really was. 2 years before everything fell apart, I had made a decision, one that would end up changing the course of Nexora's future, though no one realized it at the time. When I designed the contract engine for the City of Chicago project, I included a biometric lock at the very end of the process. It was not flashy or dramatic. It was simple, silent, and intentional. A digital fingerprint tied to my credentials, my retina scan, and my approval key. Until that signature was entered, no contract would be considered valid. Not by the system, not by the city, not by law. It was not about control. It was about security. I had seen what happened when companies rushed to push half-tested systems into production, and I wanted to make sure no one could bypass that final checkpoint. At the time, no one questioned it. In fact, I had brought it up in a development meeting when we were finalizing the architecture. Everyone agreed it was a smart layer of protection. But like most things in corporate life, once it was implemented, it faded into the background. No one paid attention to how it worked. Only that it did. Years passed, teams changed, and most of the people who knew about the biometric lock either left the company or forgot it existed. I never reminded anyone. Not because I wanted leverage, but because I assumed they would never be foolish enough to ignore something so critical. That assumption, like many others I had made at Nexora, turned out to be wrong. When Miles came in and started reshaping the company from the top down, he focused on speed and appearance. He cared more about how fast something looked finished than how stable it actually was. The Chicago contract was his crown jewel. He wanted it live, sealed, and paraded in front of investors as quickly as possible. He let Sienna lead the final push, having her merge the last pieces of code and mark the release as finalized. Then came the announcements. The press releases were polished. The champagne flowed in the executive suite. Emails congratulating the team flooded inboxes across the company. They were already calling it the most successful rollout in Nexora history. But there was one problem, a very big one. They had skipped the final biometric step. No one had entered my approval key. No one had triggered the city's authentication endpoint that required my fingerprint for completion. And without that, the contract was not legally binding. It was nothing more than a sophisticated draft. Pretty to look at, yes, but useless in the eyes of the law. It was like printing a check without a signature. All the pieces were there. But until that one final mark was applied, it meant absolutely nothing. I watched from home as the news spread. Nexora's name lit up across tech blogs and financial sites. Analysts praised their agility. Investors applauded the new leadership. Internally, they were planning bonuses. And yet, none of them seemed to realize that the biggest deal in company history was hanging on a thread they did not even know existed. A thread only I could tie. Miles had not once mentioned the biometric layer. Sienna had no idea it was part of the release process. They had pushed their final build with so much confidence. They never even double-checked the deployment logs. They believed it was done because they wanted it to be. I could have stepped in. I could have sent a quiet email, reminded someone about the lock, and let them save face. But they had already erased me. They had already written me out of the narrative. So I let them celebrate. I let them publish the story of their success. And I waited, because I knew the moment would come when someone, most likely from the city's legal department, would try to verify the final contract and discover that the authentication had failed, that the system was still waiting for my approval. And when that happened, Nexora's fantasy of success would crash headfirst into reality. There was something deeply satisfying about it. Not revenge, not cruelty, just justice. They had called my work outdated. They had treated my experience like a burden. And now, the one thing standing between them and a complete disaster was the very piece of architecture they had dismissed. They had rushed to the finish line without looking at the map. And now, they were lost, without even knowing it. By that point, I had already accepted that I was out. My name had been quietly erased from the project credits, from the company history, and from the daily conversations. But what they could not erase was the architecture I had built, and the final lock they had forgotten. I needed to be sure before I made a move, though. So I reached out to someone I trusted, Victor Elm, one of the legal advisors working with the city of Chicago. Victor and I had worked together years ago when the contract system was first developed. He was meticulous, honest, and not the type to miss details. If anyone could confirm whether the biometric lock was still in effect, it was him. I kept the message simple. No background, no emotion. Just one question. Is the biometric signature still a required step for validation on the city's side? He replied less than 10 minutes later. His email was short, almost clinical. Yes, it is still pending. No legal transfer of funds has occurred. That was it. That one line confirmed everything. Nexora had launched their big announcement. They had signed nothing. They were parading a deal that, legally speaking, did not exist. And in their arrogance, they had no clue. It was a house of cards sitting on a missing signature. Mine. That was when I knew I had leverage. Not out of spite, but out of principle. They had erased me, but I still held the key. I was not going to grovel to get my job back. I had no interest in walking back into an environment that had thrown me aside so quickly. But I was not going to walk away quietly either. I had built something critical, something valuable. And if Nexora did not respect it, maybe someone else would. So I made a call I never thought I would. I picked up the phone and dialed Cyrus Vega, the CEO of Techspire, Nexora's biggest competitor. Cyrus and I had worked together nearly a decade ago. Back then, he was still building Techspire into a serious player in enterprise infrastructure. I had helped him troubleshoot a major compliance issue when his team was drowning in red tape. We had not spoken in years, but I knew he would remember. I kept it short. I told him what Nexora had done. I explained how the biometric key still held everything in limbo, and I told him, honestly, that I was ready to walk away from Nexora for good. There was a pause, a long one. Then Cyrus simply said, "Come in tonight?" It felt like flipping a switch. I did not waste time. I grabbed my laptop, my documentation backups, and the small USB key that housed my authentication chain. I arrived at Techspire's main campus just after 9 p.m. The building was mostly dark, but the executive floor was still alive. Cyrus met me in person. He looked older, sharper, and far more composed than the last time I had seen him. He shook my hand and said, "You always did know how to build things right." We went into a private room, and I laid everything out. The biometric lock, the missing signature, the false deployment Nexora had pushed through, the legal consequences if the city discovered the truth without Nexora fixing it first. I even showed him the original logs, the parts of the system I had quietly monitored after I was pushed aside. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he asked just one thing. "Are you willing to rebuild this somewhere that actually gives you credit?" I nodded without hesitation. Cyrus made a call, not to his board, not to legal, to his infrastructure head. He said, "We are shifting priority. I want her leading our new proposal for Chicago." Nexora just handed us a gift. The next few hours passed in a blur of whiteboards, NDAs, and quiet planning. I never mentioned revenge. I never even mentioned Miles. It was not about getting back. It was about moving forward, on my terms. By morning, I had a new contract in hand, an executive title, and the first draft of a counter-proposal already forming. Nexora had handed me every piece of leverage I needed, and now I was going to use it. Not out of bitterness, just because they had forgotten who built the system they depended on. And some lessons do not land until the cost is real. That night at Techspire felt electric. I spent 6 straight hours in one of their glass-walled conference rooms, surrounded by engineers who were eager but unfamiliar with the core system I had built. I walked them through every layer of the architecture, the original validation framework, the API logic tied to city regulations, and most importantly, the biometric signature protocol that sat at the center of it all. They asked smart questions, they took notes, and by midnight, they understood exactly what kind of opportunity we were sitting on. I had already emailed Victor the mirrored documents. With his guidance, we rewrote the contract logic so that it would pass the city's backend checks without raising flags. There was no plagiarism, no trace of Nexora's branding. It was my original framework, optimized and clean. We submitted it just before sunrise. The next day, I kept quiet. I did not check the news. I did not talk to anyone at Nexora. I just waited. I knew their big press event was scheduled for Friday morning. I had seen the digital invites and the teasers all over their LinkedIn page, celebrating our landmark $2.1 billion partnership with the city of Chicago. The banner said. There were pictures of champagne being wheeled into the office, branded notebooks, and gift bags for the executives who had supposedly landed the deal. But I also knew the truth. They had no deal. The city system was still waiting for a biometric signature, and the only one that would ever arrive was from me, under a different company name. By Friday morning, the energy on Nexora's side must have been at an all-time high. I pictured the catering team setting up in the main lobby, the balloons, the photo ops, all based on an assumption that no one had bothered to verify. And then, exactly 48 hours after we submitted, the City of Chicago's procurement office released an official update to their portal. I got the notification through Victor's forwarding system. The subject line was simple. Public Notice of Contract Award, City Systems Integration. I clicked the link, heart racing, and there it was in black and white. Awarded to Techspire Inc. contract subject to biometric authentication from authorized system architect. It hit like a thunderclap. Nexora had been so confident that they had won. They never even noticed the competition coming. And now the deal they had already celebrated, printed, and promised to shareholders had vanished. The wording was surgical. No emotion, no drama. Just a fact. Techspire was now the selected vendor. Miles was on stage when the notice went live. I did not have to be in the room to imagine the chaos. Reporters checking their phones, the PR team scrambling, someone in the back whispering to an assistant, and then someone handing him their phone, showing him the city's website. That moment, that exact moment was the one I had waited for. I did not gloat. I did not post anything online. I did not call anyone at Nexora to rub it in. I stayed silent. That was more powerful than anything I could have said. Let them explain it. Let them scramble to understand how they had been outmaneuvered by the person they had tried to erase, the woman who they assumed was out of the loop, the one who had stayed up late fixing the flaw in their own system while they slept comfortably, thinking it was all under control. What they did not understand was that legacy is not just about who gets credit on the slide deck. It is about who holds the real keys to the infrastructure. They had overlooked every safeguard I had built, every protocol I had designed, every signature I had quietly embedded. Not for personal gain, but to protect the very system they now depended on. And that oversight cost them a deal worth over $2 billion. Cyrus called me later that afternoon. He kept it short. "It is done," he said. "The city is reaching out to schedule the onboarding meetings. You are leading them." I thanked him. I meant it. But I also knew this was just the beginning. The story would spread. Investors would ask questions. The board would want answers. Nexora would be forced to admit what they had missed. And I would be there. Not to gloat, not to seek revenge, but to build something better. On my own terms. With my name front and center. By Thursday morning, the cracks at Nexora were no longer rumors. They were headlines. The company's stock had already slipped after the city's surprise announcement. But once investors realized that the $2.1 billion contract had officially changed hands, the drop turned into a free fall. 19% gone in a single trading day. Some outlets called it a correction. Others called it a collapse. Either way, the message was clear. Nexora was no longer untouchable. Internal documents started leaking almost immediately. Meeting notes, Slack transcripts, early test results, all pointing to the same thing. They had ignored multiple warnings about the contract validation process. They had rushed the final build. And worst of all, they had deleted access logs tied to my credentials without confirming what those credentials controlled. The board of directors moved fast. By noon, Miles was asked to resign. The official statement said it was mutual, but we all knew better. The fallout was spreading, directors, managers, engineers. I watched them announce their exits one after another on LinkedIn. Some were polite, others were bitter. A few tried to spin it as pursuing new opportunities, but the timing said it all. Cyrus did not hold back either. At a press conference that afternoon, he stood behind a podium at Techspire HQ and laid it out plainly. He credited me by name, explaining that I had not only salvaged the core framework, but had completely redesigned the contract engine to exceed all current city compliance standards. Faster processing, cleaner audit trails, zero legal ambiguity. And because it was built off my original biometric-linked architecture, the city's legal team had approved it without hesitation. "This is not just a contract," he said. "It is a platform for the next decade of secure public partnerships, and the architect is right here." The media loved the story. Tech blogs, city papers, even a couple of national outlets jumped on it. One headline read, "How a fired engineer quietly dismantled a billion-dollar empire." Another said, "The woman behind Techspire's 2B power move." Reporters framed Nexora as bloated and arrogant, too focused on PR and not focused enough on technical accountability. I was not interested in revenge, but I could not deny it felt satisfying to see the narrative shift. For so long, I had been the quiet one in the room, the one whose work got praised, but whose voice got overlooked. Now, the industry was listening. And then came the messages. My inbox exploded. Old colleagues, former mentors, people who had ghosted me the minute I left Nexora. Now they were sending me long paragraphs about how they had always admired my work, how they regretted not speaking up, how they believed in my vision all along. Some wanted jobs. Some wanted to meet for coffee. A few even hinted at joining Techspire if I could put in a word. I read every message, but I did not reply right away. Not because I was angry, but because I needed space to decide who had really meant it and who was just chasing the next wave. What struck me most was how quickly power dynamics can change in tech. One week, you are disposable. The next, you are essential. The architecture I had designed 2 years ago, once dismissed as overly cautious, was now being used as a case study for secure infrastructure design. What they used to call overthinking was now labeled future-proof. It made me wonder how many other engineers had been silenced or pushed out before their ideas had the chance to prove themselves. It reminded me why I had built those safety layers in the first place. Cyrus gave me full authority to hire my own team, no red tape, no interference. "Build it your way," he said. And I planned to. Not out of spite, but because I finally had the room to do it right. Secure, scalable, transparent. A system that would not just serve the city, but could set a new standard for digital governance across the country. As for Nexora, They went quiet. The remaining execs posted generic updates, trying to spin things positive. But the damage was done. Their reputation had taken a hit that no amount of rebranding could fix. And the one name they would not dare mention, mine, was the one echoing across every tech conference and city office that week. I did not need their approval anymore. I had already built something better. 2 weeks after the contract transfer was finalized, Cyrus called me into his office. It was late, the lights in the building were dimmed, and most of the team had already gone home. I thought he wanted to talk next steps. Maybe strategy, maybe hiring, but instead, he slid a folder across the table and said, "You earn this." Inside was the offer letter. Chief Executive Officer, full authority, full control. No interim title, no strings. He said he had seen leaders come and go, but I was the only one who had both built the machine and understood what it meant to protect the people it served. "This is your company now," he said. "Take it wherever you want." It did not feel real at first. I spent so long being told I was not ready, not visible enough, not polished enough to lead. Even after saving a multi-billion-dollar contract, I half expected someone to step in and take the credit. But no one did. Instead, the Techspire board unanimously supported the decision. The employees, many of them former Nexora talent, stood and applauded when Cyrus made the announcement. There were no whispers, no backroom politics, just clarity. I had not just proven a point. I had opened a path. One of my first official acts as CEO was to launch something personal, something overdue, the Second Act Fellowship. It was a scholarship and mentoring initiative for women in tech over the age of 35 who had been laid off, overlooked, or told they were too senior to adapt. I knew those words too well. I had lived them. The fellowship provided funding, coaching, and direct placement opportunities. No gimmicks, no quotas, just a promise. If you still had the fire, we would help you build again. The first 10 recipients were women who reminded me of different versions of myself. Quiet, stubborn, brilliant, and tired of being invisible. I did not launch it out of bitterness. I did not need revenge. But I remembered. I remembered every meeting where I was spoken over. Every project I finished that someone else got credit for. Every late night spent triple-checking systems that leadership claimed were already perfect. I remembered being escorted out of a building I helped build. I remembered the silence in my inbox when I asked for help. So no, I did not hold a grudge. But I made sure no one would forget what happened when they underestimated someone like me again. The city skyline looks different now. Not physically, but emotionally. Every time I walk into our downtown headquarters, I pass the same streets where I used to drink coffee on solo lunch breaks, wondering if any of my ideas would ever matter. Now, I see teams I hired, systems I architected, contracts I rewrote. I see purpose in every detail. And I see pride. Not ego, not arrogance, just the quiet knowledge that I earned every piece of this life one brick at a time. They thought they had buried me under politics and bureaucracy. But all they did was clear the path for something stronger. We won the Chicago contract? Yes. But that was not the true victory. The real win was proving that integrity, skill, and resilience still meant something in tech. That you could lead without compromising your values. That people could trust systems again if they were built by hands that understood more than just profit margins. That legacy was not something granted. It was something you earned line by line, failure by failure, step by deliberate step. Nexora became a footnote, a cautionary tale in case studies about arrogance and oversight. Meanwhile, Techspire grew, quietly, confidently, and without theatrics. We earned new government contracts, expanded internationally, and rebuilt our internal culture from scratch. I did not bring in flashy slogans or make bold promises. I just told the truth, and I made sure every single person on our team knew they were seen, heard, and valued. So now, when people ask if I got my revenge, I smile. Because I did not just win, I rebuilt the game. And this time, I made sure the rules were fair, the doors were open, and the right voices were finally at the table. What they thought was my exit, it was only my beginning.